Welcome back. This is People's History. Today we're looking at chapter 11. I'm super excited to be here as usual. I can't wait to talk about China and the fall of the Qing dynasty and all of the things that kind of encompass what happened to China in the 19th century that leads to this 20th century of change for China. We won't talk a lot about the 20th century just yet. We're kind of doing the precursor to what will be World War One and kind of the situation that led to World War One. So today we're basically talking about empires in collision. We're talking about Europe, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and how they all coexisted or did not coexist during the 19th century. All of these things kind of led into what was to be World War One, or the Great War, however you'd like to call it. So you're in my classroom right now. This beautiful map right here is of colonial possessions. So it's a 3-part video for this week. We're going to talk about China, and then there'll be a video on the Ottoman Empire and kind of the decline of the Ottoman Empire leading into World War One, and also Japan and kind of how they rise to power and really start to take advantage of China after, you know, the fall of it during the 19th century. All right, so let's just hop into it. So the 19th century kind of starts with Emperor Qianlong, who sends a letter to King George. We have to remember that this is in 1793, so it's just after the Revolutionary War in the United States. So King George had been handed this defeat by the then would-be United States. So the Chinese emperor sends him a letter, and in that letter it basically details that China no longer needs any of the raw goods or products that Britain is selling them, nor does it need their influence in their country. It was kind of just a proclamation. There was no real follow-through on it. King George actually did send troops into into China, and wasn't met with much resistance. Reasons for this lack of follow-through by Emperor Qianlong and the Qing dynasty was mostly like they had a huge amount of population growth because of the Industrial Revolution, but they didn't set up the infrastructure to properly feed and maintain a large population like what they were seeing. And so as a result, you started to have these tax collectors be soldiers, and they would take advantage of the peasants, thus resulting in peasant uprisings here and there, and you started to hear murmurs of just some different problems that were taking place within the country. That leads into the Taiping uprising. So the peasants are really struggling at this point in China, and they're looking for some avenue to voice their displeasure and something to move away from that Confucianist, nearly feudal system of power where you're talking about you have landlords and peasants, and then you have your emperor and your dignitaries above them. And so it's, they wanted to move away from that. Hong Xiuquan, I think is how you say it, Hong Xiuquan. So he was the leading figure in the Taiping uprising, which was a Christian movement, a Chinese Christian movement within China. Took place from 1850 to 1864. It was fairly successful within those 14 years. Some interesting facts about that uprising. So Hong Xiuquan actually claimed to be the younger brother of Jesus himself. Okay, and his goal with the whole Taiping uprising was to heavenly kingdom on earth. Okay, heavenly kingdom on earth is what his main goal was. And kind of the ways that he saw that they would get there was 1, to end prostitution, 2, to have sexually segregated camps, so in other women would be in one camp, men would be in the other. 3, the abolition of private property, radical land distribution to where all people had access to purchase land, and the end of opium smoking. Opium, we're going to put a little pin in it, and we're going to come back and talk more about opium in a little while. Opium is a big deal in China during the 19th century. Opium dens are all over the seaboard of China, and the distribution within the country becomes vast. We'll get to that in a minute. So Hong Shekwan had a cousin. Okay, his cousin name was Hong Regan, and this guy also played a key factor in the Taiping uprising. And he had some more ideas about which way China should go moving forward. Some of his biggest deals was he really wanted to initiate some type of healthcare system for the Chinese peasants. Another thing that he really wanted to do was have railroads come through, and just an overall modernization of China was the view of Regan. Industrialization, newspaper, public education. Yeah, kiddos, can you imagine that people fought so you could sit your butts in my class? It's hilarious. So, Taiping Rebellion is, we're going to keep talking about that a little bit more, mostly when it comes to women at this point. Okay, so the Taiping Rebellion was fairly successful, as I said, for about 14 years. The Qing dynasty was on their heels during those 14 years, and they really started to pick up steam. Women also played a prominent role within that, especially the Hakka women. Okay, these people were less restricted than your typical Orthodox Confucian society. They had a little bit more leeway, and in fact, they didn't actually bind their feet. And so what you had was the officials of the Taiping Rebellion actually ordered the removal or the unbinding of feet, and they wanted to move away from that patriarchal society of oppressing women. They had civil exams for the women. Women were allowed to be supervisors in some capacities. Most of the time that would take place where they would be supervising other women. So there was not like direct supervision over men, but however, they did get to supervise women. Oh, there was one other factor. So one other huge factor is mutual attraction over family interests for marriage. They wanted marriage to be about you being attracted to the other person, being in love with the other person. If it's a beneficial relationship financially for your families, that's a plus. But that is not the goal of being married. And so that is a Christian value that kind of, translated into Chinese culture during the Taiping Rebellion. However, none of these reforms were consistently implemented, and the leaders still believed that the place of the women were to serve the men. These were just ideals that were supposed to come from it that didn't actually end up taking place. So kind of the lack of structure really led to the Qing dynasty supporters being able to remove the rebellion. And so although it was fairly successful for 14 years, the last couple years, they really were able to remove the rebellion because of that lack of leadership. So let's keep talking though. We're going to talk a little bit more about the Qing dynasty. The Qing dynasty, as a result of that rebellion, really was weakened. Okay, it delayed the growth of women. Okay, the women had a longer time before they actually, got some of those rights. There was 20 to 30 million deaths within China during the rebellion. Okay, and it also hurt China with European relations. Okay, so what resulted was this Western pressure. So let's talk, as I said, we put a pin in that opium. We're going to take that pin out. I know, that's cringy as you guys would like to say, but it's hilarious. So we're going to take that pin out. We're going to start talking a little bit more about the opium wars, and we're going to talk about opium itself. Okay, opium was first brought into Japan right around the 8th century. And it was brought in from Arabia through the Silk Road into China. It took in China. First, it was used as a medicine for dysentery, for stomach issues, also to relieve headaches, nausea, those type of things. And from that, it's an extremely addictive substance. And so what you started to see was the smoking of opium and these dens popping up here and there. A lot of Chinese nationalists believe that this was rotting the culture of China from underneath. It was kind of the underbelly. England took a big part in the trade and sale of opium. They would pick up the opium, sell it to China, make money, those type of things. So by 1830, the drug became extremely marketable to the Western world. So it went from 1,000 cases being sold or transported into China in 1773 to about 23,000 in 1832. It was illegal still. However, the British and the Western traders cared very little about it being illegal and continued to do so, continued to bring it into China. So led by Commissioner Li Zhen, okay, he ended up confiscating a ton of opium stores, which cost British merchants a lot of money and also a lot of influence. And as a result, the British with Queen Victoria responded in kind. And so they sent military and forced the unequal trade agreement. Okay, so unequal treaty, excuse me. And so this opened up 5 new ports to the Western world to buy and sell. It also limited the Chinese power within those ports. So now foreigners were able to buy and sell land freely. They were able to move product back and forth without being hindered by Chinese officials. Okay, so during this Opium War, which lasted from 1840 to 42, so during that 2 years, China lost control of Vietnam, Korea, Taiwan, and by the 20th century, European and Japan had really taken a foothold into China itself. China did try some self-strengthening things, really failed over and over again, kind of typified by a 1-year skirmish with Japan from 1894 to 1895, which ended in a loss by China, a brutal loss by China at the hands of the Japanese. The Japanese, on the other hand, as we'll learn later on, kind of used that victory and continued to build on it once we start talking about the Japan-Russo War. That leads us to 1898 and the Boxer Rebellion. I get super excited to talk about the Boxer Rebellion. It's not something to be really excited about because it was a brutal rebellion, but any chance that I get to say the Society of the Righteous Harmonious Fist, I am so down to do so. It is one of the coolest names I have ever heard for any organization ever. The Society of the Righteous Harmonious Fist, okay? And so they kind of got their name, the Boxer Rebellion, because of the rudimentary weapons and tools that they would use during the rebellion. Now, they were extremely brutal. They used kung fu. They used, just shovels, just whatever they had to rebel. The rebellion lasted 3 years. The goals were to remove all European influence over their society. They killed large numbers of European traders and people that had bought land after the Opium Wars. The Boxer Rebellion, they saw the European people as what the problem with China was. And so they were trying to remove that and the idea of a landlord society where the landlord owns the land and then the peasants must then pay the landlord to live. That kind of society is counterintuitive to what the Boxer Rebellion wanted. So after those 3 years, led by the Japanese and Western powers, they occupied Beijing and removed the rebellion. And after doing so, levied heavy taxes on China, crippling China at that point. So the 19th century... 19th led to a growing disenchantment with the Qing. Okay, yeah. So the 20th century, the 19th century really led to this growing disenchantment with the Qing dynasty. They were fed up with the Qing dynasty and they were ready to move on. So Qin Jin, just on the women's rights front, argued for women's rights, helped to birth the Chinese nationalism, the removal of foreigners. The Qing dynasty were those that were seen as being foreigners at this point. So they saw the Qing dynasty as foreigners and that they needed to remove them. And then some aspects of ancient Chinese culture that also need to be removed. Things like foot binding, that kind of stuff. All right, so that is it for China. I know that was a really dense amount of material. So remember, we're working out of this book, Ways of the World, Strayer. It's just a vehicle for AP review. There is no substitute for doing the reading yourself. Go out, obtain that knowledge. You're going to do amazing things. I hope you continue to watch. Our next video is going to be on the Ottoman Empire, number 2. So hopefully you enjoy it. Thank you so much.